Great, yeah, no, so thanks for coming, everyone. Yeah, no, I just sort of second what Al said. I mean, Laurent has been a great, help and inspiration to me in lots of ways. Helped me publish some of my work, and at really important times, really a great and supportive person. And such a brilliant writer. Helen told me, so my wife Helen told me that Laurent's actually written 32 books.
Yeah.
Which seems insane. Seems insane to me, and that seems like a lot even by my high expectations of you. But you know, many of those are out in English. A lot of them are in French. The first I read was this fantastic. So I studied French at A level. So I'm very bad at French, really. But I read this short book, and this is also something I really like about Laurent's books, and I think maybe we'll talk about it a bit more. But I get the feeling that Laurent is a sort of a post-academic who hates academia, which is what I want to be one day. Because I also am an academic who hates academia. But you write these really short, interesting books that provide really important and punchy interventions in a fun way. And I think that putting fun back into philosophy and academic writing is part of what you're so brilliant at, which I think is what Al was also referring to with these aphorism style things. So we'll come back to that as well. But yeah, I just want to say the first thing I read was this Theory du kamikaze, right? Theory of kamikaze, which was this book about Baudrillard and the 9/11 image, the idea of this 9/11 moment being more about a war of images than I've Isaac, my PhD student, I've referred to him to this. I tried to summarise the book because it took me about a year to read it in French. It's only about 15 pages. But it isn't yet in English. But I just found it crazy. To just posit this thing. Okay, this makes perfect sense and gives you a whole new way of thinking about what images are, and all of Laurent's stuff, does that in a really fun, interesting way. So, this will be an interesting, fun one to talk about, and I'll come to Superweak now. There's also a recent book which is out in the Polity series, Theory Redux, which is called Narco-Capitalism, which is Laurent's kind of theory of the narcotic drive of capitalism and so on. But today, we're sort of doing a London launch for Superweak, which is a great title. And I thought that's where we'd start. So I have various questions and come back to some of the things I just mentioned there. But can I say, when I saw you were writing a book called Superweak, I thought it would be about victim culture and the idea that like a Nietzschean sheep herd mentality kind of use of the word, that now the Superweak is the moral. I can hear something.
Is it me?
It could be.
No, I don't. It's not. There's no music on this machine.
Oh, it's also not me, I don't think, but maybe it is me.
Yeah.
Something on my... my phone is too smart for me. It's like doing something in the background. Okay. Now, so Superweak. Yeah, so the first question I wanted to ask Laurent is to talk about the title Superweak. And for me, when I delved into it the last couple of weeks, this isn't really... there's part of your of course, the aphorism style also seems kind of Nietzschean, and I think you're engaging with this question in a certain way of... what does a culture celebrate? Does it celebrate strength or does it celebrate vulnerability and this kind of thing? But in your first few, what do you call these? Are these chapters?
Yeah, well, I suppose they are paragraphs or something.
Yeah, these paragraphs. In these first few paragraphs, each paragraph is its own little thing. You talk about this idea of strength and weakness, and how essentially you're saying that you start with this interesting story from Musashi. Am I saying that right? So the Japanese. What is it? A samurai, a katana-wielding samurai who beats people and wins and wins and wins, and eventually comes to this point that we're exiting an age of strength in this sense, and maybe we'll come to critique later. But first, I thought I'd start with just saying, what is Superweak? Why have you chosen this topic, and why are you saying that we've moved from a society of strength to weakness, or whatever it is that you're getting at with this provocative title?
Well, thank you, Alfie. Thank you so very much first, thank you so very much to everyone at Housmans for having me. Thank you for being instrumental in organizing this, and thank you for being ready to lose a little bit of your time at this occasion. So, Well, this book, the story of this book is the following. At the beginning of, I'm going to tell a long story, long convoluted story with lots of names, but at the very beginning of the years 2000, I was working in Brussels when I was doing my PhD with the late Bruno Latour. I don't know if everyone is familiar with Bruno Latour and his good friend Isabelle Stengers. And it was a time when Bruno published a strange text in Critical Inquiry, it was 2004 something, that was called Why Has Critique Run Out of Steam? With this kind of subtitle From Matters of Fact to Matters of, to Matters of Concerns. And it was a kind of a mean text where Bruno was irritated against what he saw as a growing tendency of especially US, academia, but not only, to put, critique as some kind of a reflex of thought, an automatism of thought that would eventually lead to a situation where what is thought itself, the object of thought, becomes obliterated under the pure capacities of the person who read the object or look at the persons who look at the object and so on and so forth, because they are always they always win. And in this article, he was trying to somehow see how the critical tradition, from a very prestigious, huge tradition, had reached a point where it was about basically trying to simply win in every kind of situation, and he gives this very famous distinction, famous for those who have read the text, this distinction between let's say the objective facts that are always looked at critically as if they were not objective, but as a matter of fact, the result of a series of subjective interventions, of different form of personal strategies, and so on and so forth. Whereas beliefs, for instance, were also read as, on the contrary, the subjective beliefs and values were read as not being subjective, but on the contrary, the result of objective forces, and so on and so forth. So the objective was explained by the subjective and the subjective by the objective in such a way that in any circumstances, when you look at something, you always win. And he was a bit irritated with that, and then that was basically the end of the story for him. And I remember that at the time, I also have a series, not only with Polity, but also one in French. And I wanted to persuade, to convince Bruno to actually give a book form to this text, and he never did that. I said, oh no, nobody's interested in critique anyway. We don't give a fuck. So, and I have other things to think. And then, years passed, and he eventually died. And these ideas were still in the background. The text had circulated. For those of you who are familiar with literary studies, that perhaps Rita Felsky has used this text to try and inaugurate a way of dealing with literary texts that would also offer some kind of a shift out of the critical paradigm that had dominated the reading of text in academic circles and beyond. And simply my own idea with this book was to try to fully do justice to this kind of intuition that Bruno had left. But to do it in a way that he would never, that he would have, that he would never accept, I suppose, by at the same time offering some kind of a strange, weird genealogy of what critique truly is, if it's even possible to say what it truly is, and then to offer a more expansive idea about, okay, if critique has become a problem, then what to do next. And it's true that in the book I start with this problem, which is the problem of force, which is a problem that in the history of at least Western thought that has been completely not discussed. The idea that when you speak, when you think, when you have a conversation, when you debate, and so on and so forth, the question is always formulated as if it was some kind of a battlefield where it's always the strongest argument that wins, the most powerful idea, the most brilliant theory, in some kind of a competition for what would be, the best argument, the best visions, and so on and so forth. And so yes, the little vignette that opens the book about this, 14th century, 13th century kind of samurai who actually lived, Miyamoto Musashi, who was some kind of a super, very famous swordman that then, wrote this book, the Book of Five Wheels, that became some kind of a classic, especially in esoteric circles and so on. And it was a way to set up the scene as precisely a scene that will concern the idea of the force of thought and the fact that thought, ideas, concepts, at least in the Western context, have always been predicated upon force, and that this predication had been basically unseen and undiscussed. And I wanted to just to address that and to see if it could help us think the general problem that we have now with critique is the fact that critique has basically won. So critique has actually absolutely triumphed. Yeah. Contrarily to all those who will tell you, no, it's not true. The critical spirit is gone. People don't have, a critical look or critical gaze to. I don't agree with that. Actually, I think that the most democratic intellectual system or intellectual form of software is indeed the form of critique as precisely a system of force that gives all those who use it a power over what they meet. That is a power that will always triumph over what they meet, that will always obliterate to some extent what they meet, and put them in a position which is always a position of superiority, which could apply to basically anything. A movie that you go to see, a restaurant where you go and eat, up to very sophisticated philosophical systems or political options. There's always a moment when you can say, "No, that's not interesting," and then you use this whole history and the whole dispositive of critique to make it to give, let's say, some kind of a justification for the fact that your judgment, when it happens, let's say, is indeed all that there was to say about what exists. So I suppose that was the basic first, basic intuition.
Yeah, no, there's a lot here I want to pick up on, and I thought it was super interesting in the book to think about. Well, I try and connect a few things. As you say, you go to this genealogy of critique from Foucault onwards. What is critique, and so on. And I think it's interesting the way you put it there. And this connects to the strength and weakness thing. Is our society about as critique won because it's making this? I like the way you use the phrase, turning the debate into a discussion or ideas into a battleground. Who should win? And I think this is super important to me. For me, it came, surprising to me. I've always thought that this sounds rude, so apologies to any Americans. But I'd always thought when I started working with an American organisation, with Susie, in fact, there, I suddenly realised that for me, when I read something, I try to look for what I like in this thing. And try to pull out what is something I can use or like or respect in what I'm reading. And I suddenly realised that there's this whole group of people, this whole world of thinking based on the opposite, based on sort of putting two figures or ideas in a debate culture, like as if it was Oxford Union or something like that, and seeing which one comes out on top or whatever. And I think, I don't know if you necessarily... but I read your interesting Facebook post about the death of Habermas the other day, in which you interestingly said that one of the problems with Habermas is this celebration of debate or whatever, and it sort of comes down to this. To me, there's two ways of seeing the world, and critique and people. I know people have tried to say that critique and criticism are different. People have tried to make different distinctions, but it seems to me that there's two ways of thinking about ideas and philosophy, which is one which is kind of like reading for what you can use or what you can draw out or bring to life in a new way or whatever, and another which is basically based on the principle like it was like a WWE Royal Rumble or something, where you take turns to throw these ideas into an arena with each other and see which one comes out on top or whatever. And it seems that is the one that has dominated our way of thinking about ideas, and by doing that we've lost something. Is that yes. Where you're going?
Absolutely. And this kind of agonal, if you say, this kind of agonistic dimension of thought that comes, that already exists that already exist in early Greek philosophy and so on and so forth. So yeah, I suppose that what I've been interested is to try and tell this story, but tell this story in a way where this question of force is not simply it's not simply about being right, it's not simply about having the strongest argument and so on and so forth, but it's through this very the predication of force upon ideas and upon concepts and upon theory in general, and then also upon how we use them in conversations, daily conversations, political debates, academic conversations, and so on and so forth. I suppose that the whole idea was then to try and scratch the surface of what seems to be simply a conversational thing or something that only belongs to philosophy, and to try and show how behind this there was a whole, let's say, juridical, political background that was actually active, that was still there, and that was like still colonizing somehow our mind in such a way that indeed when we use critical tools in our work or in our daily life and so on, it's actually not us talking or not us thinking, but a very understanding of what would be, let's say, the legitimacy of a position. Who would be actually legitimate to talk and for which reasons? So behind the very idea of judgment, the very idea of critical judgment, the very idea of this moment of crisis that critique is as a judgment, because you know that in Greek, right, critique, crisis, krisis means literally judgment, right, and not any kind of judgment, not a kind of judgment that was there at the very beginning of the history of Greek law, but the moment when, especially in the law of Crete, when they decided to make some kind of a shift in the way they understood the very activity of judging. So the early, let's say, Greek mode of judgment was very simple, was basically arbitration, right? You would arrive, you would say, okay, someone has stolen, my sheep, it's this guy, and according to the rules of our village, this penalty should apply. And then the other guy would say, no, that's not true. First, I didn't steal the, like in the Freud story, right? I didn't steal the sheep. If I did steal it, it's not me. And then if I did steal it, it's not the rule that applies to. So, and they would have a conversation, and then the judge would simply say, okay, you're right, and that would be the end of it, right? But at some point, they realized that there were problems that were not covered by those customs and conversations, and there was a moment when judges, so arbiters, had to step forward and say, okay, actually, I will tell you what are the rules. I will give you the rules that apply to your case, and because those rules no one knows them, I will make some kind of I will pronounce something like an oath, and then I will tell you what rule is. And it created a huge change that literally opened up the possibility for a subject to actually tell from its own position of speech the truth that there was about the type of rule applying to a given situation. And this form of judgment was called krisis in Greek. So it was the krisis was this kind of invention of the possibility for a subject to tell the law, basically. And it's very funny to see that when Immanuel Kant at the end of the 18th century actually created this kind of monument of critique, the three big critiques, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment, which is usually presented as the kind of the birthbed of critique, but that I consider as the monument, the kind of the tombstone actually of critique, the moment when critique was dead, the moment when actually Kant formalized it. He used precisely, he described, let's say, the critical process as precisely the same, as a subject in some sort of intersubjectivity, discussing with other subjects the type of law that will apply to his or her own relationship, let's say, with the world. In a way that is at the same time quite new, but that connects directly, let's say, with this very idea of when you express a judgment, it's not simply that you tell your position or you express an opinion. It's that you, let's say, you invoke a form of power that goes very deep in our capacity to tell what is the rule applying to the world that surrounds us. And this capacity to tell the rules, so basically to build them, is what has given to everybody, each and every one of us, the same capacity, which is at the same time genius. I mean, in terms of democratization of thought compared to the ancient system of authorities, it's indeed something revolutionary. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we are observing now that it puts us also in some kind of a pat position, like in chess. Because since we all have the same capacity to be the legislator of the world that surrounds us, and we have the same equal capacity to actually judge it according to the laws that we are going to pronounce, then we are in a situation where anybody or everybody, there's no decisive, let's say, argument, because every argument is decisive. So it puts us in this kind of very strange situation that we can experiment in everyday life. How are you going to persuade a flat earther that actually the earth is not flat? The answer is you cannot. And the other way around, the flat earther will never convince you that actually the earth is flat. You'll stick to your idea of the world is round. And of course, in both cases, in both situations, the whole apparatus of critique is used. So the idea that, of course, first you need to argument about your position. This argumentation takes the form of reasons that you have to pronounce. The reasons, is shaped into arguments of all kinds. These arguments, in the end, refer to a form of regulation of the world that is best embodied here now in the 21st century in science, as the very embodiment of reason. So there's flat earther, they are fascinating because of the science that they bring on the table when they have to speak about, science from not only in terms of informal terms, but also literary arguments. No, because, gravity, as a matter of fact, means that, blah, 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 blah. And they will, send you documents over documents testifying by, experimentation and so on and so forth, believing so deeply in objectivity, right? While claiming that this objectivity, of course, serves their own purpose. So it's let's say that there's a big jump that I'm making, of course, but there's some kind of a link that exists between these very strange origins of thought, small changes that with time will become bigger and bigger in the history of law and politics, that actually allow us to draw some kind of a landscape about this idea of critique, the uses of critique, how it works, and to see that it goes deeper than simply a question of opinion versus truth, or in terms of reason versus delusion or so on and so forth. But it's really about shaping a world in a way that certain type of discourses are allowed and not others. And the types of discourses in question are the discourses that. That's the way I try to present it. That are the discourses that stop. So basically, that's what the judgment does. There's a moment when you've put all your arguments on the table. You have evoked, let's say, the forces of critique, and then your job is done. The earth is flat, or the earth is round, or the left is right, or the right is left, and so on and so forth, right? And the problem that we are facing, I think, that I'm trying to address with this book is, okay, this is all very nice, but if this kind of reconstruction that I'm sketching has any meaning, it means that literally because force in thought necessarily leads to this form of judgment, this kind of cut. Mm-hmm. Then it means that literally half of any process of thinking is just put aside. Yeah. Which is, and then okay, now we know that okay, you don't like this movie. All right, this movie is shit. Okay, fine. And then and then what? This politician, this right-wing politician is an asshole. Okay, and then what? The other side, and then what? And then the question that I'm asking in the book, I suppose, is what about the second half? So what about the half that is left aside? That is the other part of the cut. Once the cut is made, what are you going to do? And I suppose that then I'm trying to make a series of proposals, I suppose, about how to fill the gap. The gap.
Yeah. Okay. So lots here I want to sort of speak to, but come to a question in a second. But I think I first want to say that anecdotally it's so valid and so true that not just with the examples of like a flat earther or something, but in everyday life, I suppose one of the things that people are noticing and do notice is that the way we reason with each other has totally changed, and this kind of call to other structures of authority, which would be a point of reference to say, well, look, for example, silly example, but if you had a disagreement with your auntie at Christmas dinner, and then you might 20 or 30 years ago be able to say, well, actually there's an article in The Guardian that proves the contrary, but now of course they'll just say, well, the bloody Guardian, or your grandma might say to you, I saw something on GB News this morning, and you say, well, that's just GB News. So it is totally right that this decentering of thinking has happened, and I guess I'm trying to think about that in psychoanalytic terms myself, but I'm also thinking of like Mladen Dolar's arguments in the book you published, Rumours, and other times where he talks about what the death of the name of the father really means, and fathers can be bad, but also when you lose this centering force which can be a kind of authority, what actually happens? Well, it ends up in this kind of strange world of this non-critique, I suppose. But so I'm coming to your point here, which I think is really important. I think one of the things it's tempting to say, and what you were just saying in your answer, is that basically, but you're not saying that the breakdown of these kind of central authorities. I really thought it was interesting in this part, subjects with an attitude, which I think is part of what you were just talking about. You talk about how subjects lose the ability to resist authority or whatever. And I think you think in critique, and this is in the half of thinking that isn't happening now, there's a real important, let's say radical, for want of a better word, force that's being neglected or whatever in that. So you're not saying that we need to sort of restore those things. You have a list of 5 things: the judicial, the I can't remember them, but the pillars of critique. Let's say you don't want to restore those. And the really interesting thing in what you say in this part is the subject has the means to demand it, or whatever. This is the phrase you use here to say that to be a critical subject, you have to have the means to be a critical subject. Essentially, is what you're saying. Right, if I'm getting that right. So I think here I want to ask something on the back of what you just said. To me, this seems like that part at least seems like a Marxist position, that the reason why we don't have the capacity to do critique is because we haven't got the means to demand critique to happen. So this seems like it could be almost a Marxist position, which is not that people are getting this wrong, but that people haven't got the means to get this right. So I guess my question is, with regards to what you were saying, this thing that isn't happening, this type of thinking that isn't happening, because I'm totally with you in what you said about when people just say, oh, this right-wing politician's an arsehole, and you're left thinking, that can't be the end of this, thinking hasn't begun, what about the rest of the thinking that needs to be done? But I'm asking whether, it's, why is this rest of the thinking, this other half, not happening? Is that because people don't have the material conditions to be able to demand critique, or?
Yeah, I suppose you're right. It's true that I don't really touch upon that in the book, because it's a book that it's a little bit kind of an obsessive book. It's a book that tries to they even have drawing. Yeah, they even have stupid drawings.
It has tables. I like tables.
I don't know why I do that because I don't take that seriously anyway. but I don't know. I wanted to draw things, I suppose, and I wanted to have But it's true that it's about a book about structures, if I may say, structures of thought. Seems very abstract, but it's also a book about cooking. So it's about kung fu, cooking, Japanese architecture, biojewelry. So it's a book that tries to speak about structures of thought by using materials that are literally hysterical, in the sense that it jumps from one place to another without any sense of or any desire for cohesion or stuff like that. But then, because I'm a little bit, an obsessive person, in the end, it becomes a little bit, coherent, I suppose, perhaps a little bit too much. Hence the drawings and the tables. But to answer your question, I guess that one of the interesting things about the situation in which we are is precisely that it signs something that probably most of us have long desired, namely the fact the literal crumbling of the whole liberal agenda about who has the right to talk and who has not. So actually it's quite nice that we are in this situation of pat, where no one can say to another, your grandma, perhaps mine also, there's no way now. And perhaps it's good news that the whole rational Habermasian, system of conversation with some kind of a ticket that you have to be able to buy at the entrance to be able to participate in the game suddenly is just, fucked up. No one will, rebuild that. Or if someone tries to rebuild it, it will be super violent. I'm expecting something like that to happen. Government, for instance, finally taking over, the internet, for instance. This at some point they will realize that their own little pathetic lives is at risk, and they will just do something, or they will just disappear into oblivion, and then good riddance. So this, to some extent, it's good news, and it's something that I would like to stress. It's not a critique of critique. This book, it's an attempt at reconstructing what critique comes from, how it developed through time, through what kind of arguments and what forms of thought, in order to precisely expose its structural elements in a way that then, as I said, I can start investigate what are the missing elements of the structure, so that I can recuperate the structure. Not in order to say, I have a new philosophy or a new theory of critique that is better than all the other theories of critique that were before. Come on.
That would be the opposite.
That would be completely grotesque. but in a way that would simply give room for thought to other ways of envisaging ideas of theory. Perhaps the one that you mentioned earlier, about looking for the good thing in what you read and so on. But that would not negate critique as a kind of a principled position, and I don't know what I was about to say about all that, but So the question of the means is a good question. I mean, it's not part of the book, but I suppose that there's a moment when we will have to do something a little bit more specific than sociology about precisely the means, access to thought. And how it is indeed structured in a world like us. My intuition would be that in order to answer that, it's not simply about putting it's the problem of capitalism, for instance. If people don't have equal means into exploring what goes beyond, it's not the problem of liberal democracy. It's literally the problem of the structure of the world itself. So the question of the structure of a thought echoes, let's say, something like a cosmos structure, something that is really of a cosmic dimension, the general infrastructure that then materializes into, I don't know, indeed, for instance, the internet, the press, then the whole real infrastructure, roads, and blah, 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 blah. But all that, it's not in that book. Actually, I'm a little bit busy now with a planetary book, a book about the planet and so on. So that, discussed that a little bit. That we book 33, I suppose. So I'm not talking about that in this book. It's already an attempt to try and draw a map, because I think we're a little bit lost with criticism, especially if I may say that, us leftists, right? Because that's where we come from, right? Yeah. That's the basic tool that we have. That's the tools that also woke us up at some point. I did law school, right? Law school in the 1990s. Come on, the very idea of critique was already, you could get fired simply for uttering the word critique in that context. So critique saved my life as a lawyer, so critical legal studies and so on and so forth. So I realize the importance of it, and I realize that this is where I come from. So it's not trying to diss it, but it's really about trying to reconstruct it in a way that it's not simply a slogan that we use because of Foucault, or because the Frankfurt School, or because of Marx. We have to be critical, otherwise we're not leftists anymore. I think that there's much to do actually in terms of exploration of what comes after, in terms of stopping with precise judgment as a form of cut that produces discontinuities, and thinking in terms precisely of continuities. I think it could be a lesson of people like Deleuze and stuff like that. Well, somehow it could be a lesson drawn from some Japanese philosophers. It could be a lesson drawn from forms of jazz or forms of cooking, which is about how do you construct continuities after judgment, after the cut. How do you elaborate? How do you build forms of thread that allows you to keep going, and keep going in a way that's always exploratory. It's not simply survival, but it's really about orientation into a world that is basically opaque.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that is what is really nice about this book, and I wanted to. You started talking about it there. This question of the law, question of judgment. I wanted to ask you something about how you'd come to this through the kind of legal world, because obviously I know you, and I know that you did law school and then were a philosopher of law, and now you don't do that in an academic context. And one of the things that I'm super interested in is this question of post-truth, which right in the middle of this book you have a section called post-truth, and I read that thinking, well, this will give me a good question for Laurent, but I really found myself totally confused by the whole section and no question from it, but except for to note that you think of critique and judgment as very closely related things, and you do that in that section and in other sections right through this book. This question of judgment and critique is bound really closely together, and that is, I think, to do with your own legal history and how much you think about this in terms of the law. So I did kind of want to and by the way, I thought it was funny in the table that the result of law is death, or whatever, like law does a judgment and it results in death. But anyway, I wanted to, my question, I suppose, is like, when people think about reading a book about critique, they wouldn't think immediately of the legal system. This would not be a book for lawyers. But can you say something about this question of law, judgment, and critique, and how they relate for you, and why, obviously it could be your own story. It is your own story, but it's also why those things are so critically connected here.
Okay. Well, I'm a law professor, but I hate so passionately anything that is related to law. I suffered through law school, and then for some reason I received grants to write stuff, do kind of postgraduate shit, and then do a PhD, and because I'm very lazy and I was very against the idea of working or having some kind of a decent job. So I took the money and I kept being a lawyer until the moment when I eventually became a law professor for some reason. But it was impossible. It was just impossible. And I guess that it took me, after the completion, of my degrees, it took me almost 10 years before I started to reconcile myself a little bit with law. When I discovered the work of a French legal historian, Yann Thomas, whose work is translated into English, so you should read that, who was an historian of Roman law. And he wrote amazing things about strange, weird legal institutions, about the fictional power of law and stuff like that. That really, started to change my mind a little bit. And it was also the moment when I was working on Deleuze. I wrote this small book on Deleuze's philosophy of law, under the influence again of Latour and Stengers. And I realized also there was something there that I hadn't seen in law that they were talking about. And that's when I started to hammer this distinction, which is at the same time a very, first year law school distinction, but a distinction that is taken for granted so much that it's not examined any longer, which is the distinction that the Romans did between jus and lex. It's very complicated to explain in English, because in English it's law and law, right? In every other Indo-European language, Spanish, Italian, German, blah, 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 there are two different words for that. One describing, let's say, of course, the normative dimension of law, the fact that law has something to do with rules, with ought to be's and stuff like that. Then the legal, so to speak, and then there is another aspect, which is not the legal, but it's the juridical, and the legal and the juridical are very distinct. And there's always been a part of law, and that's why I realized through my reading of Yann Thomas, there has always been an operational part of law, or an inventive, let's say, or a fictional, in the sense of also of fabulation, of invention, and even to some extent of delirium, that is part of law understood from the point of view of the juridical and not the legal, not the rules, not the norms. And I started perhaps to reconcile myself with law when I started to look a little bit deeper into this kind of operational thing and realize that actually there's something seen from that lens. There's something deeply anarchic, actually, to law, if you understand it from the point of view of the juridical. Of course, it's a form of anarchy that is completely, silenced by the general ethos of lawyers, by a certain understanding of the combination that there must be between law as a practice and some grand ideas about society, about how people should behave and so on and so forth. So much so that this operational juridical dimension has been actually hidden behind or under some kind of a dome of normative discourses that has made so that we are now confusing the two. And what I've been trying to do within the field of legal philosophy or legal theory was to try and make this operational dimension re-emerge, this anarchic, inventive, non-normative dimension of law, the thing that makes so that you can resurrect the dead with law. You can invert the flow of time. You can change the very nature of things. A dog, that's French law, but I don't think it would work in English law. But when you sell a farm, there's the need to, a farm is a complex thing. It's not simply a building. It's also fields. It's the stock. It's a bit of everything, but it's also the animals. And so the animals, in order to be that you could actually sell them as some kind of a package, you have to assimilate them to bricks. So they have to change the nature from living animals into literally buildings to be able to be part of the patrimonium that you can then transmit and so on and so forth. So with legal inventions that all come back in the Western context to Roman inventions, you can do literally whatever. You can, the natural relationship between parents. What the fuck? We don't care about that. We call that adoption. That you rebuild, the relationship between human beings. You can change. You can change. Literally, whatever. There's no limit. The only limits will be the limits that society, normativity, politics, will give. But from the point of view of invention, I suppose there is no limit. And the claim that I've been making in the field of law was for lawyers, especially progressive lawyers, to find back this inventive operational dimension, because these days, the only ones that are actually taking that seriously, they are not talking about principles, they're not talking about rights and stuff like that, the fucking right-wing motherfucker bastards, or the guy in the law firms, trying to actively reshaping the very legal design of the world through a very, very conscious understanding of the operational dimension of law. So I suppose that so my claim when I talk to lawyers that you too take that seriously. It's not simply a political struggle that we have to find to win at the parliament or wherever. It's also a technical thing. It's the difference that exists between, let's say, Trump and the Project 2025. I'm afraid of Project 2025. I'm not afraid of Donald fucking Trump, right? Yeah. And it's the same. Let's say that it's the same. It's the same with law. So we would need kind of an infrastructural, operational project from the point of view of law that would work that way. And I suppose that this book is an illustration of that, because I suppose that the way I read critique as some kind of a late emanation and a paradoxical emanation of our understanding of law as norm, of our understanding of our need for legality, forms of legality that would allow us to classify, distinguish things in the world according to some fixed principles, norms and rules and so on and so forth. And what I'm advocating is a form of anarchic way of thinking, argumenting, creating concepts and ideas that would be akin, or that would have some kind of a relationship with this operational fabulation that we can see, which is very pragmatic and at the same time completely science fictional, that we can see at work in legal practice when it's done, I wouldn't say seriously, but when it's done, let's say, properly, which most lawyers don't do for, again, sociological reasons and so on and so forth. So the link, the deep link goes, I suppose, goes with that. And if I've started to embrace post-critical ideas, it's in this perspective, the perspective of what kind of operations. I spoke of continuities earlier. What kind of operations can we create that would allow theory, so to speak, to reconcile itself with its own capacity to produce delirium, rather than trying to exhaust reality, to give explanation about what is happening. I'm a big consumer of that. I love it when I read that. I don't know. There's a new book by Timothy Mitchell. I will obviously read it. Because I'm interested in knowing all that. But I also have the feeling that it's not enough. It gives me an explanation that I wanted in advance, and perhaps I knew it in advance. I know it's the bad guys.
No, but I agree with that.
So now, what kind of operations can we build intellectually that would make that useless?
Yeah, look, I mean, I want to see if people have questions, but listen, I just want to say I totally agree with this. I mean, I not just agree with it, but it speaks to something I just feel so frustrated by in life. Is that, it is the case that so many of the things we read, even by people we respect and love, who might write very long books, which we really enjoy reading the whole of, but really it just ends up effectively confirming what we already think and feel. And you can see, if you look at covers around this bookshop, you can look at some covers and say, well, I know what the argument is here. I know what this book is going to say. It was bad in Ukraine, or things are bad at the moment in Palestine, or whatever. And those things are correct, and we want to know those things and have those affirmed or whatever. But it isn't thinking per se. It isn't thinking actually. Sorry, what did you say?
And the covers are nice, so we buy them for the covers. So.
But it isn't the whole of thinking. It isn't the whole of thinking to do that. To say, these are the people we hate, or these are the things that are wrong with the world, or whatever. It is, I think, as Laurent put better. It's half. It's at most half of thinking, and to be interested in that other half is really important. And yeah, to me anyway, that causes a bit of delirium and makes me feel good and interested in the world, which is not always easy to be. So this is why it's a great book. So thank you, Laurent.
Well, thank you.